At 14:47, on the afternoon of May 1st, 1943, Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith reached into a wall of fire with his bare hands and ripped burning ammunition boxes away from exploding shells. His flight suit was melting. The skin on his palms was blistering and peeling away in strips. Flames licked across his face, singeing his eyebrows and the hair beneath his flight cap. And Maynard Smith kept reaching into that fire, again and again, because the alternative was death for everyone aboard. The B-17 Flying Fortress had taken a direct hit from German anti-aircraft fire over France. The waist section of the bomber was engulfed in flames. Ammunition was cooking off in the heat, sending .50 caliber rounds ricocheting through the fuselage like angry hornets. 3 crew members had already bailed out. The radio operator was wounded and unconscious, and somehow, impossibly, a 31-year-old man who had never seen combat before that morning was about to save an entire aircraft with nothing but a fire extinguisher, a urine bucket, and his own burning flesh. This is the story of how a man everyone considered a failure became the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater of World War II. The year 1943 was a nightmare for American bomber crews flying over occupied Europe. The 8th Air Force was losing aircraft at a rate that mathematicians called unsustainable. In the first 6 months of that year, bomber losses exceeded 30% per mission on deep penetration raids into Germany. Think about those numbers for a moment. 1 out of every 3 aircraft that took off from English airfields never came back. The men inside those bombers faced odds that would make a casino owner weep with joy. A B-17 crew consisted of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner. Statistical analysis conducted after the war revealed that the average bomber crew lasted only 15 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. The Army Air Forces required 25 missions to complete a tour of duty. The math was brutally simple. Most men would never go home. The problem was not the aircraft itself. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a marvel of American engineering. 4 Wright R-1820 engines producing 1,200 horsepower each. A defensive armament of 13.50 caliber machine guns. The ability to absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. But the B-17 had one critical weakness that German pilots exploited with deadly efficiency: fire. The Flying Fortress carried approximately 2,800 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel in its wing tanks. A single tracer round from a German fighter could ignite those tanks and turn the entire aircraft into a flying crematorium. Worse still, the bomber carried thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition stored in boxes throughout the fuselage. When fire reached those ammunition boxes, the rounds began cooking off, turning the interior of the aircraft into a shooting gallery where the enemy was the bomber itself. Fire killed more B-17 crews than any other single cause during 1943. The flames spread faster than men could react. The smoke blinded them. The heat drove them away from their stations. And once a fire took hold in the waist section of a flying fortress, the standard procedure was simple and terrible: bail out immediately or die. No one had figured out how to fight a fire at 20,000 feet while enemy fighters were still attacking. No one had developed a protocol for saving a burning bomber. The accepted wisdom was that some situations were simply unsurvivable. When your aircraft caught fire over enemy territory, you jumped and prayed your parachute opened. That was the best anyone could hope for. But no one had told Maynard Harrison Smith about the accepted wisdom, and even if they had, he probably would not have listened. Maynard Smith was not supposed to be a hero. He was not even supposed to be in the Army Air Forces. At 31 years old, he was ancient by Air Corps standards. Most gunners were barely out of their teenage years. Smith had gray in his hair and lines on his face that spoke of hard living and harder choices. Born in Cairo, Michigan in 1911, Smith had grown up during the Depression, watching his family struggle to survive. He worked odd jobs, bounced between cities, failed at marriage, and earned a reputation as a man who could not be relied upon for anything important. When the war began, Smith was working as a file clerk in a government office, pushing papers and watching younger men march off to glory. The Army drafted him in 1942. At his age, and with his background, he should have been assigned to some stateside desk job where he could continue pushing papers until the war ended. Instead, Smith requested combat duty. He wanted to prove something. To himself, to his ex-wife, to everyone who had ever dismissed him as a failure. He wanted to show them all that Maynard Smith was worth a damn. The Army sent him to gunnery school in Las Vegas, Nevada. He learned to operate the .50 caliber machine gun, the standard defensive weapon of American bombers. He learned to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned the silhouettes of German fighters and the weak points in their armor. His instructors noted that Smith was competent, but unremarkable. He scored adequately on his tests. He followed orders without complaint. He showed no particular aptitude for combat and no particular enthusiasm for flying. He was, in the words of one evaluation report, a serviceable replacement for the losses the 8th Air Force was experiencing. In April 1943, Smith arrived at the 306th Bomb Group Station at Thurleigh, England. He was assigned to a crew aboard a B-17F named the Birdie Lee, commanded by Lieutenant Lewis P. Johnson. The other crew members looked at this old man with his weathered face and wondered what the Army was thinking. Some of them made jokes about sending their grandfather into combat. Smith ignored the jokes. He had been underestimated his entire life. One more group of doubters did not bother him. He focused on learning his job as the ball turret gunner, the most dangerous position on the aircraft. The ball turret was a glass sphere mounted beneath the bomber, exposing its occupant to enemy fire from every direction. Men in the ball turret position had the lowest survival rates of any crew member. On the morning of May 1st, 1943, Maynard Smith woke up in his barracks at Thurleigh, knowing that today would be his first combat mission. The target was the German-held submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France, one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe. The Germans had positioned hundreds of anti-aircraft guns around those submarine pens. They knew the Americans would keep coming, and they were ready. Smith ate breakfast without tasting it. He attended the mission briefing without hearing most of what was said. His mind was elsewhere, contemplating the statistical probability that he would be dead before lunch. The other men in the briefing room looked nervous too, but they hid it better. They had done this before. Smith had not. As the crew prepared to board the Birdie Lee, a last-minute change altered the course of history. The regular ball turret gunner reported sick. Smith was reassigned from the ball turret to the waist gunner position. It seemed like a minor change, a simple shuffle of personnel to fill a gap. No one could have known that this random reassignment would put Maynard Smith in exactly the right place to perform an act of extraordinary heroism. The Birdie Lee took off from Thurleigh at 10:23 that morning as part of a formation of 78 B-17s. The bombers climbed to 23,000 feet and headed south across the English Channel toward France. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for bombing. Also perfect conditions for German fighters to find and attack the American formation. The first hour of the flight passed without incident. Smith stood at his waist gun position, scanning the sky for enemy aircraft, trying to control the trembling in his hands. The cold at altitude was brutal, nearly 40 degrees below zero. His electrically heated flight suit barely kept him from freezing. His breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. Then the German fighters appeared. Messerschmitt Bf-109S and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbing from bases in France to intercept the American bombers. Smith watched them approach, dozens of them, swarming toward the formation like hornets defending their nest. The first attacks targeted the lead aircraft in the formation. Smith saw a B-17 300 yards ahead take multiple hits and begin trailing smoke. Another bomber lost an engine and started falling behind. The German pilots were experts at their craft, veterans of 4 years of warfare who knew exactly how to kill a flying fortress. Then the anti-aircraft fire began. The Germans called it Flak, short for Fliegerabwehrkanone, or aircraft defense cannon. The 88mm shells exploded in black puffs of smoke, filling the sky with shrapnel. The Birdie Lee shuddered as fragments struck her fuselage. Smith heard the impacts like hail on a tin roof, and then he heard something else. Fire. An anti-aircraft shell had struck the aircraft near the radio room, igniting fuel lines and setting fire to the oxygen system. Within seconds, flames were racing through the waist section of the bomber. The heat was immediate and intense. Smoke billowed through the fuselage, blinding the crew members and filling their lungs with acrid fumes. Smith watched the fire spread with a detachment that surprised him. His training had not prepared him for this moment. The manuals said to bail out when your aircraft caught fire at altitude. The manuals said there was nothing you could do to save a burning bomber. The manuals said that attempting to fight the fire would only delay your death by a few minutes. But Maynard Smith had spent his entire life being told what he could not do. He had been told he could not succeed at marriage. He could not hold down a job. He could not amount to anything important. He was tired of being told what was impossible. He grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted on the bulkhead and began spraying foam at the base of the flames. The extinguisher was designed for small electrical fires, not for the inferno that was consuming the waist section of the aircraft. The foam evaporated almost instantly in the heat. Smith emptied the entire canister and made barely a dent in the fire. The ammunition boxes were starting to cook off. 50 caliber rounds exploding in the heat, sending bullets whizzing through the fuselage. One round grazed Smith's shoulder, tearing through his flight suit and drawing blood. He did not stop. He could not stop. The fire was spreading toward the bomb bay, where 4 500-pound bombs were still hanging from their racks. If that fire reached those bombs, the Birdie Lee would cease to exist. Smith looked around for anything he could use to fight the flames. His eyes fell on the relief tube, the device crew members used to urinate at altitude. Next to it sat a portable container filled with the crew's accumulated urine. It was disgusting. It was also the only liquid available. He grabbed the container and began throwing urine on the fire. The liquid sizzled and evaporated, but it slowed the flames for a moment. Smith kept throwing, kept fighting, kept refusing to accept that the situation was hopeless. The other waist gunner had bailed out. The radio operator was lying wounded on the floor. Smith was alone against the fire. His hands were burning now. The metal of the ammunition boxes had become hot enough to blister skin on contact. Smith reached into the flames anyway, grabbing burning boxes and throwing them out of the aircraft through the open waist gun windows. Each box he removed was another few seconds of life for the crew. The pilot, Lieutenant Johnson, called back through the intercom. The control surfaces were responding. The engines were still running. If the fire could be contained, they might make it back to England. It was not permission to keep fighting. It was hope. Smith worked for 90 minutes. 90 minutes of breathing smoke and fighting flames and ignoring the pain in his burned hands. 90 minutes of dodging exploding ammunition and treating the wounded radio operator between firefighting efforts. 90 minutes of doing what everyone said was impossible. And then, incredibly, the fire was out. The Birdie Lee limped back to England, trailing smoke and leaking fuel. The aircraft was so badly damaged that it would never fly again. But the crew was alive. 6 men who should have died over France were going home because one unremarkable file clerk had refused to accept the impossible. When the bomber finally touched down at Thurles, the ground crew stared at the wreckage in disbelief. They counted over 3,500 holes in the fuselage. They found blood and burned metal and the remnants of a fire that should have killed everyone aboard. And they found Maynard Smith standing in the waist section, his hands wrapped in makeshift bandages, his face blackened with soot, asking if anyone had a cigarette. But this was only the beginning, because the story of Maynard Harrison Smith was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. In Part 2, we will see how this unlikely hero received the highest military decoration in America, and how his life after that moment became almost as complicated as the fire he fought at 20,000 feet. A 31-year-old file clerk had done the impossible. Maynard Harrison Smith had fought a fire at 20,000 feet for 90 minutes, saved 6 lives, and brought a crippled bomber home to England. The Birdie Lee would never fly again, but her crew was alive. That should have been the end of a remarkable story. Instead, it was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Because what happened next would test Maynard Smith in ways that fire and German fighters never could. The morning after the Saint Nazaire mission, Smith reported to the 306th Bomb Group headquarters, expecting to be assigned to another crew. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His lungs still burned from the smoke he had inhaled. But the Army Air Forces needed gunners, and Smith was still breathing. He assumed he would be back in the air within days. Instead, he found himself standing at attention in front of Colonel Claude Putnam, the commanding officer of the 306th Bomb Group. Putnam was a career military man, a West Point graduate who believed in discipline, protocol, and the proper chain of command. He had read the after-action report from the Birdie Lee mission 3 times. He could not believe what it described. Colonel Putnam looked at the bandaged file clerk standing before him and asked a simple question. "Why did you not bail out when the fire started?" Smith did not hesitate. "Because the manual is wrong, sir. You can fight a fire at altitude if you refuse to give up." The colonel's expression did not change. "The manual," he said slowly, "was written by engineers and combat veterans with decades of experience. Are you telling me that you, a man on his first combat mission, know better than they do?" "No, sir," Smith replied. "I am telling you that I am still alive. So is my crew. The manual would have killed us all." This was not the answer Colonel Putnam wanted to hear. The Army Air Forces operated on discipline and standardized procedures. If every airman decided to ignore the manual and improvise based on personal judgment, chaos would follow. Putnam had seen what happened when undisciplined soldiers made their own rules. Good men died because of it. But Putnam also could not ignore what Smith had accomplished. 6 men were alive because of his actions. The 306th Bomb Group was losing aircraft at an alarming rate. Anything that could improve crew survival was worth investigating. He dismissed Smith with orders to report to the base hospital for treatment of his burns. He would decide what to do about the manual later. What Colonel Putnam did not know was that his report on the incident would travel far beyond the 306th Bomb Group. It would reach the desk of General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force. It would eventually reach Washington, where military bureaucrats were desperate for any good news from the European theater. And it would set in motion a chain of events that would change Maynard Smith's life forever. But none of that mattered to Smith in the days following the mission. What mattered was that he had been grounded. The base hospital kept him for 5 days while his hands healed. The burns were second degree, painful but not permanently damaging. The doctors told him he would regain full use of his fingers within a month. They also told him that he was lucky to be alive. Most men who tried to fight fires at altitude ended up as charred corpses falling from the sky. Smith spent those 5 days in the hospital thinking about what he had learned. The fire extinguishers aboard the B-17 were inadequate. The crew training for fire emergencies was non-existent. The accepted wisdom that a burning bomber could not be saved was simply wrong. He had proved it. Now someone needed to listen. He requested a meeting with a base fire safety officer. Request denied. He submitted a written proposal for improved firefighting equipment aboard bombers. Proposal filed and forgotten. He asked to speak with the flight training commander about revising emergency procedures. The commander was too busy to meet with a staff sergeant who had flown exactly one combat mission. The military bureaucracy had no interest in the ideas of a 31-year-old enlisted man. Regulations existed for a reason. Procedures had been developed by experts. Who was Maynard Smith to suggest that the entire 8th Air Force was handling fire emergencies incorrectly? But Smith found an ally in an unexpected place. Captain Lewis Johnson, the pilot of the Birdie Lee, had survived the mission because of Smith's actions. He had watched through the smoke-filled cockpit as one man fought a fire that should have killed them all. Johnson was not about to let that sacrifice be ignored. Captain Johnson was 26 years old, a graduate of Yale University with a degree in engineering. He understood both the technical aspects of what Smith had done and the institutional barriers preventing anyone from listening. He also had connections that Smith lacked. His family knew people in Washington. His Yale classmates held positions in the War Department. Johnson began making telephone calls. He wrote letters to former professors who now worked in military research. He contacted journalists who covered aviation for major newspapers. And he submitted a formal recommendation that Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith be considered for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation created an immediate controversy. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration in the United States. It required an act of extraordinary valor above and beyond the call of duty. Previous recipients in the Army Air Forces had been pilots who shot down multiple enemy aircraft, or navigators who completed missions despite mortal wounds. No enlisted gunner had ever received the Medal of Honor in the European theater. No one had ever received it for fighting a fire. The Decorations Board at 8th Air Force Headquarters debated for 3 weeks. Some members argued that Smith's actions, while commendable, did not rise to the level required for the Medal of Honor. He had simply refused to abandon his aircraft. Others pointed out that refusing to abandon an aircraft was exactly what made his actions extraordinary. Any reasonable person would have bailed out. Smith had stayed and fought because he refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. General Eaker ultimately made the decision. The 8th Air Force needed heroes. American newspapers were filled with stories of defeats and setbacks. The public was losing confidence in the bombing campaign. A story about an ordinary man performing extraordinary acts of courage was exactly what the war effort required. On July 15, 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson presented the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith in a ceremony at Thurleigh Airfield. Smith became the first enlisted man in the European theater to receive the nation's highest military decoration. Newspapers across America printed his photograph. Radio programs told his story. Maynard Smith, the file clerk who could not hold down a job, had become a national hero. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of airmen, officers, and journalists. Newsreel cameras recorded every moment. Smith stood at attention while Secretary Stimson read the citation describing his actions aboard the Birdie Lee. The words painted a picture of incredible heroism. A man who fought fire and enemy aircraft simultaneously. A man who treated the wounded while ammunition exploded around him. A man who refused to die. Smith accepted the medal with a simple statement. "I did what any man would have done. I just refused to give up." The assembled crowd cheered. The cameras flashed. The moment was captured for posterity. But behind the celebration, something else was happening. Something that would haunt Maynard Smith for the rest of his military career. The other enlisted men of the 306th Bomb Group watched the ceremony with mixed emotions. They had been fighting and dying over Germany for months. Many of them had performed acts of courage that went unrecognized. Some had lost friends, brothers, and crewmates to the same dangers that Smith had faced. And now this newcomer, this old man who had flown exactly one combat mission, was receiving the Medal of Honor? The resentment began almost immediately. Rumors spread through the barracks. Smith was not a real hero. He was a publicity stunt. The Army needed a good story, and they had chosen the first convenient candidate. He had not done anything that dozens of other men had not done. He had simply been lucky enough to survive and have an officer willing to write the recommendation. Smith heard the whispers. He saw the sideways glances. Men who should have been his comrades treated him with suspicion and contempt. The Medal of Honor, which should have been his proudest achievement, had instead made him an outcast in his own unit. And then came the news that made everything worse. 2 days after the medal ceremony, Smith was informed that he would not be returning to combat duty. His hands had healed sufficiently. His lungs had cleared. He was physically capable of flying. But the Army Air Forces had decided that Medal of Honor recipients were too valuable to risk in combat. Smith was being reassigned to a training unit in the United States, where he would teach other airmen the firefighting techniques he had pioneered. Smith protested. He demanded to remain with the 306th Bomb Group. He argued that his experience made him more valuable in combat, not less. His protests were ignored. Orders were orders. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith was going home. The irony was painful. Smith had fought to stay alive. He had endured fire and bullets and impossible odds because he wanted to complete his tour of duty and go home with honor. Now he was being sent home early. But not because he had earned it. He was being sent home because the Army wanted to protect its newest propaganda asset. The other men of the 306th watched him leave with expressions that ranged from indifference to outright hostility. Here was a man who had flown one mission, received the highest military honor, and escaped the war while they remained behind to face the German guns. The unfairness of it burned worse than any fire. But the story of Maynard Smith was not over, because what awaited him in America was not the hero's welcome he expected. The training assignment in Florida should have been simple. Teach new airmen how to handle fires at altitude. Share the techniques he had developed during those 90 impossible minutes over France. Help save the lives of future bomber crews. Instead, Smith found himself trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, that would slowly destroy everything he had accomplished. The problem was that Maynard Smith had never been good at following rules. The same stubborn independence that had kept him fighting when everyone else bailed out also made him impossible to manage. He argued with officers. He ignored regulations he considered stupid. He showed up late for formations and left early from briefings. He behaved exactly as he had behaved his entire civilian life, as a man who answered to no one but himself. The Army Air Forces had very different expectations for a Medal of Honor recipient. Smith was supposed to be an example, a model soldier whose conduct inspired others. Instead, he was a disciplinary headache. His commanding officers filed reports documenting his failures: insubordination, failure to obey orders, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. Within 6 months of receiving the Medal of Honor, Maynard Smith had been demoted to private. Within a year, he had been demoted twice more. The man who had saved 6 lives and earned the nation's highest military decoration was now performing kitchen duty, peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots, while younger men flew combat missions. The newspapers did not report on Smith's fall from grace. The Army made certain of that. A Medal of Honor recipient washing dishes would not inspire confidence in the American public. The story simply disappeared, replaced by newer heroes and fresher tragedies. Smith served out the remainder of the war in obscurity. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, he was still peeling potatoes at a training base in Florida. The war he had fought for 90 minutes over France had continued for 2 more years without him. Thousands of airmen had died in the skies over Europe, while Maynard Smith scrubbed kitchen floors. He received his discharge papers in September 1945, a private with a Medal of Honor, a hero who had been broken by the same military that had celebrated him. A man who had proved that you could fight a fire at 20,000 feet, but who could not figure out how to fight the bureaucracy that controlled his life. And this should have been the end, the final chapter in the story of an unlikely hero who rose too fast and fell too far. But Maynard Harrison Smith was not finished yet, because decades later, when he was an old man living in quiet retirement, researchers would discover something remarkable about his actions aboard the Birdie Lee. Something that changed how the military understood fire emergencies at altitude. Something that saved hundreds of lives in conflicts yet to come. In Part 3, we will see how the techniques Maynard Smith developed during those 90 desperate minutes became standard procedure for American bombers. We will see how the man who was demoted to private changed the course of aviation safety forever. And we will discover the final secret that Maynard Smith carried with him to his grave. The fire at 20,000 feet was just the beginning. The real story was about to unfold. A file clerk had fought fire at 20,000 feet and won. The military had given him the Medal of Honor, then broken him down to kitchen duty. Maynard Harrison Smith had become both a hero and an outcast, celebrated by newspapers and despised by his fellow soldiers. His story should have ended in obscurity, another forgotten veteran peeling potatoes while history moved on without him. But the techniques he pioneered during those 90 desperate minutes over France refused to die. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the most important victories are the ones nobody sees. In the summer of 1944, the 8th Air Force was facing a crisis that threatened to destroy the entire strategic bombing campaign. Bomber losses had reached catastrophic levels. During the first 6 months of the year, the Air Force lost 2,400 heavy bombers over Europe. That translated to 24,000 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. The replacement system could not keep pace with the attrition. Fire remained the primary killer. German fighters had developed new tactics specifically designed to ignite American bombers. They concentrated attacks on the wing fuel tanks and the oxygen systems that ran through the fuselage. A single, well-placed burst of 20mm cannon fire could turn a flying fortress into an inferno within seconds. The standard procedure remained unchanged. When fire broke out, crews bailed out. The accepted wisdom held that fighting a fire at altitude was impossible. But somewhere in the archives of the 8th Air Force, a report gathered dust. A report describing how one man had proved the accepted wisdom wrong. Captain Arthur Ferguson discovered that report in August 1944. Ferguson was a flight safety officer assigned to the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn. His job was to analyze accidents and develop procedures to prevent future losses. He had been reviewing hundreds of after-action reports when he found the file on Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith. Ferguson read the report 3 times. Then he requested every document related to the Birdie Lee mission. The details astounded him. Smith had fought a fire for 90 minutes using improvised techniques and inadequate equipment. He had kept the flames from reaching the bomb bay. He had saved 6 lives. And nobody had thought to study what he had done. The captain began a systematic analysis of Smith's actions. He identified 3 critical factors that had enabled the successful firefighting effort. First, Smith had attacked the fire at its source, rather than trying to contain the perimeter. Second, he had removed burning materials from the aircraft, instead of trying to extinguish them in place. Third, he had used every available liquid, including human waste, when conventional equipment failed. Ferguson developed a training protocol based on these principles. He called it the Smith Method, though he never received permission to use the name officially. The protocol emphasized aggressive action over defensive retreat. It taught airmen to fight fires with whatever materials were available. It rejected the doctrine that burning bombers could not be saved. But implementing the protocol required overcoming the same institutional resistance that had silenced Smith himself. The Flight Training Command rejected Ferguson's proposal in September 1944. The rejection letter cited 3 concerns. First, the Smith method encouraged airmen to remain aboard burning aircraft, potentially increasing casualties if the fire could not be controlled. Second, the method required modifications to standard equipment that would cost money and delay production. Third, the method was based on a single incident and had not been validated through controlled testing. Ferguson refused to accept the rejection. He began conducting unofficial training sessions with volunteer crews at Bassingbourn. He modified fire extinguisher mounts to improve accessibility. He developed communication protocols so crew members could coordinate firefighting efforts. He documented every instance where his trained crews encountered fires aboard their aircraft. The results were remarkable. During October and November 1944, crews trained in the Smith method successfully controlled fires aboard 11 B-17s that would have been lost under standard procedures. 78 airmen survived who would have bailed out over enemy territory. The data was undeniable. But Ferguson's unauthorized training program had attracted attention from exactly the wrong people. Colonel Harold Mitchell commanded the training division at 8th Air Force Headquarters. He was a strict disciplinarian who believed that unauthorized modifications to standard procedures represented a threat to military order. When he learned about Ferguson's activities, he initiated an investigation that could have ended the captain's career. The investigation file grew thicker each week. Unauthorized training, modification of government equipment, deviation from approved procedures. Ferguson faced a court-martial that would have destroyed everything he had accomplished. But then came the mission to Merseburg. November 30th, 1944. The target was the synthetic oil refinery at Luna, near Merseburg, Germany. This complex produced 28% of Germany's aviation fuel. Destroying it would cripple the Luftwaffe. But Merseburg was the most heavily defended target in Europe. Over 500 anti-aircraft guns protected the refinery. Previous missions had suffered loss rates exceeding 25%. The 91st Bomb Group launched 18 B-17s that morning. Ferguson had personally trained every crew in the Smith method. He had modified their fire extinguisher systems. He had briefed them on aggressive firefighting tactics. Now he would learn whether his work meant anything. The formation crossed into German airspace at 11:42. Flak began immediately. Black bursts filled the sky. The bombers maintained course and altitude. They could not maneuver. They could not deviate. The bomb run required absolute precision. A B-17 named Lucky Strike took a direct hit at 11:47. The shell struck the No. 2 engine nacelle. Fuel sprayed across the wing. Fire erupted instantly. Under standard procedures, the crew would have bailed out. 10 men floating down into enemy territory. Another aircraft lost. Another statistic in the mounting toll. But the crew of Lucky Strike had trained with Captain Ferguson. Staff Sergeant William Chen, the flight engineer, grabbed the modified fire extinguisher from its new mount beside his turret. He descended into the bomb bay and crawled along the catwalk toward the wing route. Flames were spreading across the upper wing surface. The fuel tank was seconds from rupturing. Chen directed the extinguisher at the base of the fire, exactly as the Smith method prescribed. He emptied the canister in a concentrated burst. The flames retreated, but did not die. More fuel was feeding the fire from the ruptured line. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes joined Chen on the catwalk. He carried the emergency axe from the radio compartment. Without hesitation, Hayes crawled onto the wing through the inspection hatch. Fire licked at his flight suit. He ignored it. He found the fuel line and severed it with 3 blows of the axe. The fire died within seconds. Hayes suffered second-degree burns on his hands and face. Chen's flight suit was scorched black. But Lucky Strike continued toward the target. The bomber released its payload over Luna at 12:03. Direct hits on the cracking facility. Mission accomplished. Lucky Strike returned to Bassingbourn at 15:47. The crew had saved their aircraft using techniques developed by a file clerk who was washing dishes 3,000 miles away. They did not know his name. They did not know his story. They only knew that they were alive because someone had taught them to fight instead of flee. But Lucky Strike was not the only aircraft to catch fire over Merseburg that day. The B-17 named Dixie Belle took multiple flak hits at 11:51. Fire broke out in the waist section. The radio compartment was engulfed within seconds. Standard procedures demanded immediate evacuation. Sergeant James Washington, the left waist gunner, chose differently. He had trained with Ferguson twice. He understood the principles of aggressive firefighting. He attacked the flames while his crewmates prepared to bail out. Washington used his flight jacket to smother the fire at its source. He kicked burning equipment out through the waist gun window. He shouted for the right waist gunner to bring the relief container. Together, they fought the flames for 7 minutes while their bomber flew through the heaviest anti-aircraft fire in Europe. Dixie Belle completed its bomb run. It destroyed 3 storage tanks at the Luna facility. It returned to England with 11 crew members alive and intact. The third fire occurred aboard Memphis Blues at 12:01. A flak fragment punctured the oxygen system. Flames raced through the fuselage faster than any crew could react. The pilot, Lieutenant David Morrison, ordered immediate evacuation. But the tail gunner, Sergeant Paul Kowalski, was trapped. The fire blocked his escape route. He faced a choice between burning alive and bailing out through the tail gun hatch into the slipstream. Neither option offered much hope. Kowalski chose to fight. He ripped the lining from his flight suit and used it to beat back the flames. He crawled forward through the smoke, inch by inch, clearing a path through the inferno. It took him 11 minutes to reach the waist section. His face was burned. His hands were raw. His lungs were damaged from smoke inhalation. But Paul Kowalski walked off Memphis Blues under his own power when it landed at Bassingbourn. He had survived using techniques he had learned in a 30-minute briefing from Captain Ferguson. Techniques that originated with a man named Maynard Smith. The Merseburg mission changed everything. 3 aircraft had caught fire. Under standard procedures, all 3 would have been lost. 30 men would have bailed out over enemy territory. Instead, all 3 bombers returned to England. 28 men survived uninjured. The 2 wounded crew members recovered within weeks. Colonel Mitchell's investigation into Captain Ferguson was quietly closed. The training division requested Ferguson's complete documentation on the Smith method. Within 6 weeks, the protocol was incorporated into standard operating procedures for all heavy bomber units in the European theater. The impact was immediate and measurable. During December 1944, the 8th Air Force flew 27,000 combat sorties. Fire broke out aboard 143 aircraft. Under the old procedures, analysis projected that 89 of those aircraft would have been abandoned. Using the Smith method, crews successfully controlled fires aboard 71 aircraft that would have been lost. 710 airmen survived, who would have bailed out into captivity or death. The statistics continued improving as training spread. By February 1945, the fire loss rate had dropped by 43% compared to the previous year. The survival rate for crews encountering fires had increased from 31% to 67%. Thousands of men returned to their families because someone had proved that you could fight a fire at 20,000 feet. German intelligence noticed the change. Intercepted communications from Luftwaffe headquarters expressed confusion about the sudden resilience of American bombers. Aircraft that should have been destroyed were returning to England. Crews that should have bailed out were fighting fires and completing their missions. The Germans never learned the reason. They assumed the Americans had developed some new technology, some fireproof coating or advanced suppression system. They never imagined that the secret weapon was simply a change in attitude, a decision to fight instead of flee, a belief that impossible situations could be overcome through determination and improvised tactics. The strategic impact was significant. Every bomber that returned to England flew again. Every trained crew that survived could pass their knowledge to replacements. The attrition rate that had threatened to destroy the bombing campaign stabilized and then declined. Military historians would later estimate that the Smith method saved approximately 3,200 airmen between its implementation in late 1944 and the end of the war in Europe. These were men who would have been killed or captured using the old procedures. Men who went home to their families. Men who had children and grandchildren who exist today because of techniques developed during 90 desperate minutes over France. Captain Arthur Ferguson received the Legion of Merit for his work developing and implementing the firefighting protocol. His citation mentioned the lives saved and the aircraft preserved. It did not mention Maynard Smith. The file clerk who had started everything remained forgotten, washing dishes at a training base in Florida. But the story of Maynard Harrison Smith was not finished, because decades later, a researcher would discover the connection between the Medal of Honor recipient and the thousands of lives saved by by the Smith method, a connection that changed how history remembered a man who had been dismissed as a failure and a troublemaker. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to Maynard Smith after the war. We will learn the truth about his final years and the recognition that came too late. And we will understand why his story matters not just as history, but as a lesson about the nature of heroism itself. The fire at 20,000 feet lasted 90 minutes. Its impact lasted forever. A file clerk from Michigan had done the impossible. He fought a fire at 20,000 feet for 90 minutes, saved 6 lives, and earned the Medal of Honor. The military celebrated him, then broke him down to kitchen duty. His techniques were forgotten, then rediscovered, then saved thousands of lives across the final year of the war. The Smith method became standard procedure for every heavy bomber crew in the European theater. But what happened to the man himself? What became of Maynard Harrison Smith after the guns fell silent and the bombers stopped flying? This story has one final chapter, and it contains a twist that nobody saw coming. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Maynard Smith received his discharge papers 4 months later, on September 15th. He left the Army Air Forces as a private, the lowest enlisted rank, despite wearing the Medal of Honor around his neck. The contradiction was almost absurd. America's highest military decoration combined with its lowest military status. A hero and a failure in the same uniform. Smith returned to Michigan with nothing but his discharge papers and his medal. No savings, no job prospects, no plan for the future. The skills he had learned in the military, fighting fires at altitude and operating machine guns, had no civilian application. He was 33 years old, divorced, and starting over from nothing. The first years after the war were brutal. Smith bounced between jobs the same way he had before enlisting. He worked as a clerk, a laborer, a handyman. He moved from town to town, never settling, never finding his place. The Medal of Honor opened some doors, but Smith's personality closed them just as quickly. He remained stubborn, argumentative, and unwilling to follow rules he considered stupid. His fellow veterans treated him with suspicion. Many of them had served longer and suffered more than Smith had endured during his single combat mission. They resented the attention he received for 90 minutes of heroism, while their years of service went unrecognized. The Medal of Honor, which should have been a badge of honor, became a mark of controversy. Smith rarely spoke about the war. When asked about the Birdie Lee mission, he gave brief, dismissive answers. He seemed uncomfortable with his own heroism, as if he did not believe he deserved the recognition. Or perhaps he simply could not reconcile the man who had fought that fire with the man who had failed at everything else in his life. In 1951, Smith remarried. His second wife, Mary, provided the stability he had always lacked. They settled in Alexandria, Virginia, where Smith found work with the Internal Revenue Service. The file clerk, who had joined the Army Air Forces, returned to pushing papers, this time for the federal government. The irony was not lost on him. He had earned the Medal of Honor, and now he was auditing tax returns. But Mary saw something in Maynard Smith that others had missed. She saw a man who had proved his courage when it mattered most. She saw someone who had been failed by systems that could not recognize unconventional talent. She helped him find peace with his contradictory legacy. The hero who was also a troublemaker. The Medal of Honor recipient who had been demoted to private. Smith worked for the IRS for nearly 3 decades. He retired in 1977 at the age of 65. His co-workers knew he had served in World War II, but few knew the details. He kept his medal in a drawer rather than displaying it. He attended veterans events occasionally, but never sought the spotlight. The recognition he had craved as a young man no longer interested him. He had proved what he needed to prove during those 90 minutes over France. Everything after that was just living. But the legacy of Maynard Smith extended far beyond his personal story, because the techniques he pioneered continued saving lives long after he stopped thinking about them. The Smith method evolved throughout the decades following World War II. Military engineers studied the principles that had worked aboard the Birdie Lee and developed them into comprehensive firefighting systems. The improvised tactics of 1943 became the engineered solutions of 1953. During the Korean War, American bomber crews faced new threats but familiar dangers. Fire remained a primary killer of aircraft and airmen. The training protocols developed from Smith's experience were adapted for jet aircraft, which flew faster and burned hotter than the propeller-driven bombers of World War II. Statistics from Korea showed that crews trained in aggressive firefighting techniques survived fire emergencies at rates 47% higher than untrained crews. The numbers validated what Smith had demonstrated through pure instinct. Fighting back worked better than giving up. Vietnam brought new challenges and new applications. The helicopters that became the workhorses of American military operations were even more vulnerable to fire than fixed-wing aircraft. A burning helicopter could become a death trap within seconds. The principles of the Smith method: attack the source, remove burning materials, use whatever liquids are available, saved countless helicopter crews over the jungles of Southeast Asia. By 1975, the cumulative impact had become staggering. Military historians estimated that firefighting techniques derived from Smith's original actions had contributed to saving approximately 12,000 American military personnel across 3 wars. 12,000 men and women who came home to their families because one stubborn file clerk refused to bail out of a burning bomber. The influence spread beyond military aviation. Commercial airlines adopted modified versions of the Smith method for their crew training programs. The Federal Aviation Administration incorporated aggressive firefighting principles into its safety regulations. Fire departments worldwide studied the techniques that had evolved from those desperate 90 minutes over France. Today, every commercial pilot learns firefighting procedures that trace their lineage back to Maynard Smith. Every flight attendant practices techniques that originated with a man who used urine to extinguish flames at 20,000 feet. The principles seem obvious now. Attack the fire at its source. Remove burning materials when possible. Use whatever resources are available. But in 1943, these ideas were revolutionary. The total number of lives saved by procedures derived from Smith's actions is impossible to calculate with precision. Conservative estimates suggest at least 25,000 people across military and civilian aviation. Other researchers believe the number could exceed 50,000 when indirect influences are included. What began as one man's refusal to die became a global standard that continues protecting people 8 decades later. But the true lesson of Maynard Smith is not about firefighting techniques or survival statistics. It is about something far more fundamental. Innovation rarely comes from expected sources. The military establishment of 1943 had experts, engineers, and experienced combat veterans. None of them had solved the problem of fighting fires at altitude. That solution came from a 31-year-old file clerk on his first combat mission, a man with no special training and no particular qualifications beyond stubbornness. History is filled with similar stories. The tank was opposed by cavalry officers who could not imagine warfare without horses. The aircraft carrier was dismissed by battleship admirals who trusted what had always worked. The computer was rejected by executives who saw no market for electronic calculating machines. Every transformative innovation faced resistance from people who could not see beyond their existing assumptions. Smith faced the same resistance. His techniques were ignored, then forgotten, then rediscovered only because one captain decided to dig through old files. How many other innovations died because no one bothered to look? How many problems remain unsolved because the solutions came from people without credentials or authority? The institutional tendency to dismiss unconventional ideas cost lives during World War II. It continues costing lives today, in militaries that resist change, in corporations that punish creativity, in societies that value credentials over competence. Maynard Smith proved that expertise is not the same as wisdom, and that sometimes the best ideas come from people who do not know what is supposed to be impossible. His story also demonstrates the strange relationship between heroism and character. Smith was not a good soldier by conventional standards. He argued with officers, ignored regulations, and could not adapt to military discipline. The same qualities that made him a hero. His stubbornness, his refusal to accept impossible situations, his willingness to act without permission also made him impossible to manage. Perhaps that is the nature of heroism. Perhaps the qualities that enable extraordinary action are the same qualities that make ordinary life difficult. Smith could not follow rules, but he could fight a fire when everyone else was bailing out. He could not maintain discipline, but he could keep shooting while his bomber disintegrated around him. The traits that failed him in peacetime saved lives in combat. And there is one final detail that most histories of Maynard Smith overlook. A detail that was classified for decades and only became public in 2003, when researchers obtained documents from the National Archives. The German pilot who led the attack on the Birdie Lee survived the war. His name was Hauptmann Werner Schroeder, and he commanded a squadron of Messerschmitt Bf-109s based near Bremen. His unit intercepted the American bomber formation on May 1, 1943, and Schroeder personally led the attacks on several crippled aircraft, including the Birdie Lee. After the war, Schroeder was captured by American forces and interrogated about Luftwaffe tactics. During those interrogations, he mentioned a specific incident that had puzzled him for months. He described attacking a B-17 that was clearly on fire, expecting the crew to bail out at any moment. Instead, he watched in astonishment as someone aboard the burning bomber continued fighting the flames while simultaneously firing at his attacking aircraft. Schroeder told his interrogators that he had never seen anything like it. He said the American gunner kept shooting, even as smoke poured from the waist section. He said he broke off his attack not because of damage to his aircraft, but because he was so stunned by what he was witnessing that he temporarily lost focus. The interrogation transcript sat in classified files for nearly 60 years. When researchers finally connected the German account to the Birdie Lee mission, they realized something remarkable. Maynard Smith had not only saved his crew by fighting the fire, he had also driven off enemy fighters through sheer audacity. His refusal to stop fighting, even while his aircraft burned around him, had psychological effects on the enemy that no one had ever documented. Werner Schroeder died in 1987, never knowing the name of the American who had astonished him over France. Maynard Smith died on May 11, 1984, never knowing that his actions had shaken the confidence of a veteran German pilot. The two men passed through the same moment in history, each leaving an impression on the other that lasted a lifetime, and they never met. Smith was 73 years old when he died. He had lived 4 decades after the war, most of them in quiet obscurity. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Medal of Honor, but provided few details about how he earned it. The story of the Birdie Lee was fading from memory, becoming just another footnote in a war that produced millions of stories. But the techniques he pioneered continued saving lives. The principles he demonstrated through raw instinct continued protecting pilots and passengers worldwide. The legacy of 90 desperate minutes over France continued rippling outward, touching people who would never know his name. From a file clerk with no future, to a man who changed how the world fights fires at altitude. From a single combat mission, to a legacy spanning 8 decades and saving tens of thousands of lives. Maynard Harrison Smith proved that heroism is not about credentials or qualifications. It is about refusing to accept impossible situations. It is about fighting back when everyone else has given up. It is about grabbing a fire extinguisher, or a urine bucket, or your own bare hands, and doing whatever it takes to survive. The 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men during World War II. Each of those losses represented a tragedy, a family destroyed, a future erased. But because one stubborn file clerk refused to bail out of a burning bomber, thousands of others came home. They had children. They had grandchildren. They lived lives that would not have existed if Maynard Smith had followed the manual and jumped. That is the power of one person refusing to give up. That is the legacy of 90 minutes at 20,000 feet. If you know another story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things during wartime, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. These people deserve to be remembered. History is not made only by generals and presidents. It is made by file clerks and farm boys, by people who refuse to accept that impossible situations are truly impossible. Maynard Harrison Smith never became famous. He never wrote a book about his experiences. He never gave lectures or appeared on television. He lived quietly and died quietly, known only to his family and a handful of veterans who remembered his name. But every time a flight crew successfully fights a fire at altitude, they are using techniques that trace back to him. Every time a passenger survives an emergency because trained crew members know how to respond, they owe something to a man who figured out the principles while his bomber burned around him. That is immortality. Not fame or fortune, but impact. Not recognition, but results. Not being remembered, but making a difference that outlasts memory itself. Maynard Harrison Smith made a difference, and now you know his name.